morning, great souls. Well, this is year 2 in a row for me for doing Does Satan Exist? And I think it must be because I'm somehow uniquely qualified to talk about Satan. How liberating. So my mom, who I always reference, maybe I will always when I do talks, since she's done maybe 30 years of public speaking, sent me a great Satan joke, which I thought I would read because humor is really indispensable in the spiritual path. If we take things too seriously, even in the reading, Satan wants us to believe that our thoughts are purely our own. And what that can mean is that if we do wrong or if we stray from the path, that we identify ourselves with those failures. And likewise, if we see somebody that we admire, one of the great saints or masters, and we seek to be that way, and we strive only to do that from our own power, from our own consciousness, the divide is so great. So we need to offer ourselves up into the light and see that God is the doer. And one of the best ways to do that is to have that sense of humor, to relax in your spiritual path, to not take things too seriously, and then to allow God to flow through you. So perhaps he'll flow through us all as laughter here, perhaps not. I've seen a lot of jokes fall flat here, or parts that are supposed to be serious be funny. So this is a great, I thought this was a good one. It reminds me of my son Ezra. So there was once a little boy who always went next door to play, and his mother told him not to. He would go into the other yard. So this worried his mother so badly that eventually she asked him, "Why are you so disobedient? I tell you time and time again, stay in our yard." He replied that Satan tempted him so bad, and he didn't know what to do. So the mother had a great idea. She said, "Well, tell him in the wise words of Jesus, 'Get thee behind me, Satan.'" And then she built a fence for good measure. This worked for about a week, and then one sunny afternoon, with unseasonably good weather, the mother looked out the window and did not find her son in the yard at all. She looked over the fence and saw him there. She was able to see a hole that was cut out in the fence, and the little child playing on the other end. "Jeremiah," she yelled, "come here." The boy runs. "Did I not tell you to say, 'Get thee behind me, Satan,' and stay in the yard?" He said, "Yes, but I said, 'Get thee behind me, Satan,' and then he went behind me and he pushed me through the hole." So, we won't ask how the hole got there, though. Where was Satan then? So one of the things that Master Paramahansa Yogananda, whose teachings we follow, would often say is a saint is a sinner who never gave up. And that goes along with what we were talking about with not identifying with our mistakes and with our failures, and always trying to seek our identity in God. And just that last part of the reading, I wanted to repeat it because it really does bear repeating. We should take pains then to attract uplifting currents of universal consciousness and to avoid attracting the negative, which, disease that it is, can infect our thoughts even while it leads us to believe that our thoughts are purely our own. So the question is, does Satan exist? I think we all know the answer. But there's some subtleties to it. It's for many of us here who are meditators or who have had these upward aspirations for some time now, the classic sex, wine, and money things are not as big of an issue. In fact, but I won't assume, we do have people streaming online as well, that those big three that Ramakrishna talked about, who was a great saint who Master had great respect for, just a little bit of this inward religion, right, that Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. If you're struggling on those big temptations, a little bit of God contact, a little puff of meditation, as Master called it, and then of course some type of spiritual community, that'll clear that up. But what we're talking about today is going to be the more subtle levels of how, even as a devotee, even as a Kriyaban, even as a great disciple of a great master, how Satan comes into our lives. So Master talks in his lessons about Satan as being this universal conscious force. He talks about how in the beginning of creation, God, the unmanifest, sent out his consciousness, sent out the vibrations of himself to become the universe. And along with that outward flowing energy was this universal reality, this, as we call Satan, or it's sometimes called Maya in the Eastern tradition. And that energy of outwardness sought to have its own independence. And not only that, but it was endowed with free will. And so in order to keep itself moving out, to keep its energy afloat and not going back into God, it needed to have some servants. And that's where we come in, unfortunately. So all of us, we could call ourselves on that big sea of consciousness, we are the waves. We are waves of God's manifestation. The further we get from the ocean center, the more identified we are with that restlessness, the more identified we are with that satanic force, which seeks to pull us out of our center and seeks to bring our energy downward, away from God. So one really amazing image of that I'm a very visual person, and so I like to have a picture of it. Nayaswami Bharat, who lives at Ananda village, in one of his sharing nature exercises, it's in the book, his book on Om, Om, the Melody of Love. He talks about visualizing this vast lake, and you could see that as the lake of God's consciousness, and then to imagine tributaries or rivers flowing off of it. And the further we get from that lake, you'll start to see some of these lesser streams dry up in the summertime and get crispy and crusty and filled with brush, and just without that life force. But if one can trace your way back up that creek and then to the larger river and then eventually to that lake, which is fed from glacial melt, there's just so much prana there. So Satan, this outward manifesting force, what we need to do is figure out how to reverse that flow. Not go outward, not go downward, get into the spine, get back into that ocean of consciousness. So here's some practical things. It always turns out to be like a class. I feel like we could be here all afternoon and we could do all sorts of practices here, but I wanted to continue the Bhagavad Gita reading because it cuts off right there with Satan and it doesn't give us much to go on after that. So this is from the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, from the Sir Edwin Arnold translation. So this was ending at sinful and strong is this man's enemy. Okay, so Krishna says, govern thy heart, constrain the entangled sense, resist the false, soft sinfulness, which saps knowledge and judgment. Yea, the world is strong, but what discerns it is stronger, and the mind strongest, and high o'er all the ruling soul. Wherefore, perceiving him who reigns supreme, put forth full force of soul, capital S, soul, in thy own soul. Fight, vanquish foes and doubts, dear hero, slay what haunts thee in fond shapes, and would betray. So what Master gave us is the first line of defense against this outward emanating force is God contact. The techniques that Master gave us of energization, which is a very simple way, but powerful way to, as Jesus called it, to not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Father. That mouth of the Father in yoga is the medulla oblongata, this source, this negative pole of the sixth chakra. And what we do when we energize is we find all the kinks, and with yoga asanas too, with hatha yoga, we find all the blocked areas in the body, all those dried up creek beds, and we tense them, and then we relax them, and we let the flow from that lake fill that dried creek bed. And we feel the energy flowing from that divine source. Because remember, we are all waves on that sea. And so we are part of that sea. So energy is number one. It's very hard to do what's right, and it's very hard to resist temptation if you don't have any energy. So in yoga, that's number one, is that we need to feel our connection with God in meditation. But before we can even meditate, we have to have tremendous amounts of energy pulled in from the senses. We need to shut off the sense telephones, as Master said, and unite all of these restless limbs and speech and the overload from listening to our MP3 player and the streaming. We need to shut off all the gates, and then we'll have a chance at having that God contact. So we do that, and then in order to behave correctly, we need to be able to perceive God's will in our lives. And that comes from meditation. If we don't have that stillness, if we don't have the energy to be still, really, then we can't tune into what God's will is. And Master really put it that God's will is everything in life, that His will is what binds this universe together. And if we can just simply unite our little will to His will, we will be successful. We don't have to fear. So another aspect that I wanted to talk about besides meditation and energization and yoga, these sadhana tools, is just satsang as well. To be in spiritual community. Not everybody has the opportunity right now or in this lifetime to live in a spiritual community, but there are ways that you can create community where you are. And that generosity of spirit that we talked about in the affirmation is really the way to do it. If you find yourself in the shopping market or at the library or wherever you might be, after you've had your meditation in the morning, tune back in with God. God, how can I be a channel? How can I share generously of your spirit? How can I be a channel of that spirit? But for those of you who are in spiritual community of some kind, that is just one of the best ways to progress spiritually and to move past this outward flow of energy. At Ananda Farm, where my wife and son and I are moving to very shortly, it's a true ashram environment. And what that means is it's more communal than just living nearby each other. And it offers endless opportunities to polish and smooth your rocky, craggy creek bed. One of the things is if you share a space or you share a home with somebody, you really do have to think about others first before yourself, because there's one of you and maybe 12 of the others. So you just do the math, What's going to be more important? It's going to be harmony is going to be more important. You get pushed just by the situation into thinking outside of yourself. And just besides that, to always have, everybody has good days spiritually, and everybody can have bad days. And if you're living with other meditators, and if you're working with other disciples, then the chances are you're going to be running into somebody who's having a really good day spiritually, at least every day. And so with that humility and with that openness, you can draw on their positivity. And when you're by yourself, it's so easy to let your hair down and say, "Oh, woe is me." But when you're in constant collaboration with others who are trying, it's very hard to go down. So those are two. The God contact and satsang are just indispensable spiritually. The other one is, I talked a little bit about, but it's feeling that God is the doer. So we put so much pressure on ourselves spiritually to succeed, or and it's good. It's a good thing to have that high goal in mind of being ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. But we can't do that on our power alone. We need the power and the grace of the masters, and we need our fellow Guru Bhais, and we need God's grace to flow through us. So the best way to do that pick up the Bhagavad Gita again if you haven't in a while, because Krishna lays it all out. It's amazing that that scripture, after so many thousands of years, is still so practical. It's a handbook. I'm sure that if history had played out differently, Jesus would have given us a handbook like that. But of course, there's been a lot of politics and a lot of fighting amidst that. But somehow the Bhagavad Gita, it just really is so pristine. And what he says is, if you can act at first just with the consciousness of God, or not even the consciousness, if you can act with dedicating that act to God. So before you put the fork in your mouth, or before you turn the ignition in the car to go where you want to go, to offer that up to God and say, this is for you. And then the next step would be to try to touch in with that God consciousness as you're acting. And eventually the idea is that every single successive act is a dedication and emanating from God. And what Krishna says is, if you can really do that, it's called karma yoga. If you can really do that, you will be free from karma while acting. And that's what that satanic force is. Remember, he says he seeks to bind souls. Where is it? To the wheel of delusion. That was so simple. I should have had that. And what that wheel is really fueled by karma. If we continue to act from I, me, and mine, if we continue to act from a place of my wants and desires, and not what God's will is, we will continue to be bound to that wheel. Last night, I had the real joy of dipping back into this series that came out, which I've spoken about before, called The Chosen. And they say it's the largest crowd-funded spiritual movie production of all time. And it's a really Dwapara Yuga, really new age take on Jesus and the story of his disciples. And it really shows his humanity, which is so refreshing after so many things about his crucifixion or the man of sorrow or whatever. He really does come across on the screen as being both divine as well as just a joy to be around. And one of the parables that he talks about is particularly apt for today. In this first episode of season 2, he talks about the shepherd who has the 100 sheep, and he's asking his disciple. Actually, he finds a shepherd in the crowd, and he asks him, "What would you do if one of your sheep went astray of the 99?" He said, "Well, I would leave the other 99 to go get that sheep and bring him back." And he said, "Even you would leave you've got 99 sheep here. They're all safe. You would just leave the safe sheep and go find this other one?" He said, "Yeah, because I want to bring him back home because I love him, And then what would you do?" "Well, I'd probably throw him over my shoulders and I would dance in joy, just so happy that this sheep came back." And some of the people in the crowd realized that Jesus was talking about God was the shepherd. And it just gets me every time. But that's really something that Master emphasized. Yes, there's this force, the satanic force that's seeking to keep us outward and downward, you could call it, in our consciousness. But there's this other force, this force of God, that is constantly seeking out for us and sending those vibrations of love to us. So we need to get into that love consciousness. And the way to do that is that generosity that we talked about, that generosity of spirit. When Swami Kriyananda went to Assisi, he went and visited the tiny chapel that St. Francis built, which is now covered by a gaudy cathedral. But anyway, he meditated in there, and he felt such sweetness. And he felt the sweetness of St. Francis, who a pope at one time said was, the most perfect reflection of Christ. And he said, "How could this sweetness be?" And he heard the voice, "By never judging." So God is constantly sending this love to us. If we want to get on that wavelength, we have to send that love back to him in our meditation. It can't just be I'm meditating for stress relief. I mean, these are good. That's a step. I'm meditating to achieve cosmic bliss and to blast off into outer space. Okay, that's great. But what really gets us there is if we can have that love, that shraddha is what it's called in Sanskrit, in our hearts and offer it up to God, we'll get on his wavelength. We'll make that God contact. We'll feel God's will for us in this lifetime. We won't go astray if we can feel that. And just another little quote on love that I wanted to end on there. This is from a great saint, Swami Ram Dass. He says, "Love of God means love of all beings, because God is all, and all is God." So I'm going to end with this reading from Whispers, which I didn't even have to choose. I opened up the Whispers book, and there's all these altar cards in here. I mean, just amazing, and it's the exact right reading, so I'm going to read it. This one is number 23, Prayer Demand for Removing the Cork of Ignorance. No more shall my consciousness remain bottled in this little vessel of flesh, corked with ignorance. No more will I remain moving through the sea of cosmic consciousness, night and day, years, decades, and how many incarnations. So close, yet never able to contact thy sea. Through the bursting vibration of cosmic sound and surging of thy holy name, I have removed the cork of ignorance, which so long separated me from thee, though we lived together so closely. Now my body consciousness will meet thy all-surrounding, all-pervading consciousness. No longer will I walk heedlessly in thee, but never knowing and feeling thee. Thine image within me shall meet thine image everywhere. By releasing the I-ness in me, I will know that I am thou, and that thou alone art the little egos of us all. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Amen.